Hey guys, what's up? This is honorableaggro, and today I'm actually going to be bringing you guys something a little bit different to my channel, where it's usually a gaming channel, so I have a lot of gaming videos. I'm going to be doing something, I don't know what to call it yet. I've been thinking like aggro story corner or something like that. But as you guys can see on the screen, this is a book series. I don't know if you guys know what it is or not. The Ranger's Apprentice is actually a series of 12 books that are actually one of my favorite series. And yeah, so I'm going to be narrating these books, this entire book series. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. If you don't, sorry. I do. And I hope you guys do too. And yeah, so I'm going to be reading book 1, which is The Ruins of Gorlan. And in this video, I'll be reading the prologue and chapter 1. Hopefully you guys enjoy it, and let's jump right in. And this book series is written by John Flanagan, for those who are wondering. And yeah, so let's jump in and read the prologue real quick. Morgoth, Lord of the Mountains of Rain and Night, former Baron of Gorlan in the Kingdom of Heirloom, looked out over his bleak, rain-swept domain, and for perhaps the 1000th time, cursed. This was all that was left to him now. A jumble of rugged, granite cliffs, tumbled boulders and icy mountains, of sheer gorges and steep, narrow passes, of gravel and rock, with never a tree or a sign of green to break the monotony. Even though it had been 15 years since he had been driven back into this forbidding realm that had become his prison, he could still remember the pleasant green glades and thickly forested hills of his former fief, the streams filled with fish, and the fields rich with crops and game. Gorlan had been a beautiful, living place. The mountains of rain and night were dead and desolate. The platoon of Warbles was drilling in the castle yard below him. Morgoth watched them for a few seconds, listening to the guttural, rhythmic chant that accompanied all their movements. They were stocky, misshapen beings with features that were halfway human, but with long, brutish muzzle and fangs like a bear or a large dog. Avoiding all contact with humans, the Warbles had lived and bred in these remote mountains since ancient times. No one in living memory had ever set eyes upon one, but rumors and legends had persisted of a savage tribe of semi-intelligent beasts in the mountains. Morgoth, planning a revolt against the Kingdom of Heirloom, had left Gorlan fief to seek them out. If such creatures existed, they would give him an edge in the war that was to come. It took him months, but he eventually found them. Aside from their wordless chant, Warbles had no spoken language, relying on a primitive form of thought awareness for communication. But their minds were simple and their intellects basic. As a result, they had been totally susceptible to domination by a superior intelligence and willpower. Morgoth bent them to his will, and they became the perfect army for him. Ugly beyond nightmares, utterly pitiless, and bound totally to his mental orders. Now, looking at them, he remembered the brightly dressed knights in glittering armor who used to compete in tourneys at Castle Gorlan, their silk-gowned ladies cheering them on and applauding their skills, mentally comparing them to these black-furred, misshapen creatures. He cursed again. The Warbles, attuned to his thoughts, sensed his sensed his disturbance and stirred uncomfortably. Pausing in what they were doing, angrily he directed them back to their drill, and the chanting resumed. Morgorath moved away from the unglazed window, closer to the fire that seemed utterly incapable of dispelling the damp and chill from this gloomy castle. 15 years, he thought to himself again. 15 years since he had rebelled against the newly crowned King Duncan. A youth in his 20s, he had planned it all carefully as the old king's sickness progressed, banking on the indecision and confusion that would follow his death to split the other barons and give Morgorath his opportunity to seize the throne. Secretly, he had trained his army of Wargles, massing them up here in the mountains, ready for the moment to strike. Then, in the days of confusion and grief following the king's death, when the barons traveled to Castle Erlun for the funeral rites, leaving their armies leaderless, he had attacked, overrunning the southeastern quarter of the kingdom in a matter of days. Routing the confused, leaderless forces that tried to oppose him, Duncan, young and inexperienced, could never have stood against him. The kingdom was his for the taking. The throne was his for the asking. Then Lord Northold, the old king's supreme army commander, had rallied some of the younger barons into a loyal confederation, giving strength to Duncan's resolve and stiffening the wavering courage of the others. The armies had met at Hackman Heath, close by the Slipsunder River, and the battle swayed in the balance for 5 hours. With attack and counterattack and massive loss of life, the Slipsunder was a shallow river, but its treacherous reaches of quicksand and soft mud had formed an impassable barrier, protecting Morgorath's right flank. But then one of those gray-cloaked meddlers known as Rangers led a force of heavy cavalry across a secret ford 10 kilometers up the battle and fell upon the rear of Morgorath's army. The Wargles, trained in the tumbled rocks of the mountains, had one weakness: they feared horses, and could never stand against such a surprise cavalry attack. They broke, retreating to the narrow confines of the three-step pass, and back to the mountains of rain and night. Morgorath, his rebellion defeated, went with them, and here he had been exiled these 15 years, waiting, plotting, hating the men who had done this to him. Now he thought it was time for his revenge. His spies told him the kingdom had grown slack and complacent, and his presence here was all but forgotten. The name Morgorath was a name of legend nowadays, a name mothers used to hush fractious children, threatening that if they did not behave, the Black Lord Morgorath would come for them. The time was ripe. Once again, he would lead his Wargles into an attack. But this time, he would have allies, and this time, he would sow the ground with uncertainty and confusion beforehand. This time, none of those who conspired against him previously would be left alive to aid King Duncan. For the Wargles were not the only ancient, terrifying creatures he had found in these somber mountains. He had 2 other allies, even more fearsome, the dreadful beast known as the Kalkara. The time was ripe to unleash them. Chapter 1. Try to eat something, Will. Tomorrow's a big day, after all. Jenny, blonde, pretty, and cheerful, gestured towards Will's barely touched plate and smiled encouragingly at him. Will made an attempt to return the smile, but it was a dismal failure. He picked at the plate before him, piled high with his favorite foods. Tonight, his stomach knotted tight with tension and anticipation. He could hardly bring himself to swallow a bite. Tomorrow would be a big day, he knew. He knew it all too well. In fact, tomorrow would be the biggest day in his life, because tomorrow was the choosing day, and it would determine how he spent the rest of his life. "Nerves, I imagine," said George, setting down his loaded fork and seizing the lapels of his jacket in a judicious manner. He was a thin, gangly, and studious boy, fascinated by rules and regulations, and with a penchant for examining and debating both sides of any question, sometimes at great length. Dreadful thing, nervousness. It can just freeze you up so you can't think, can't eat, can't speak. "I'm not nervous," Will said quickly, noticing that Horace had looked up, ready to form a sarcastic comment. George nodded several times, considering Will's statement. "On the other hand," he added, "a little nervousness can actually improve performance. It can heighten your perceptions and sharpen your reactions. So, the fact that you are worried, if in fact you are, is not necessarily something to be worried about of itself, so to speak." In spite of himself, a wry smile touched Will's mouth. George would be a natural in the legal profession. He thought he would almost certainly be the scribe master's choice on the following morning. Perhaps, Will thought, that was at the heart of his own problem. He was the only one of the wardmates who had any fears about the choosing that would take place within 12 hours. "He ought to be nervous," Horace scoffed. "After all, which craftmaster is going to want him as an apprentice?" "I'm sure we're all nervous," Alice said. She directed one of her rare smiles at Will. "We'd be stupid not to be." "Well, I'm not," Horace said, then reddened as Alice raised one eyebrow and Jenny giggled. It was typical of Alice, Will thought. He knew that the tall, graceful girl had already been promised a place as an apprentice by Lady Pauline, head of Castle Redmont's diplomatic service. Her pretense that she was nervous about the following day, and her tact in refraining from pointing out Horace's gaffe, showed that she was already a diplomat of some skill. Jenny, of course, would gravitate immediately to the castle kitchens, domain of Master Chubb, Redmont's head chef. He was a man renowned throughout the kingdom for the banquets served in the castle's massive dining hall. Jenny loved food and cooking, and her easygoing nature and unfailing good humor would make her an invaluable staff member in the turmoil of the castle kitchens. Battle school would be Horace's choice. Will glanced at his wardmate now, hungrily tucking into the roast turkey, ham, and potatoes that he had heaped onto his plate. Horace was big for his age, and a natural athlete. The chances that he would be refused were virtually non-existent. Horace was exactly the type of recruit that Sir Rodney looked for in his warrior apprentices. Strong, athletic, fit, and, thought Will a trifle sourly, not too bright. Battle school was the path to knighthood for boys like Horace, born commoners, but with the physical abilities to serve as knights to the kingdom. Which left Will. What would his choice be? More importantly, as Horace had pointed out, what craftmaster would accept him as an apprentice? For choosing day was the pivotal point in the life of the castle wards. They were orphan children raised by the generosity of Baron Errol, the lord of Redmont fief. For the most part, their parents had died in the service of the fief. and the Baron saw it as his responsibility to care for and raise the children for his former subjects, and to give them an opportunity to improve their station in life, wherever possible. Choosing Day provided that opportunity. Each year, castle wards turning 15 could apply to be apprenticed to the masters of the various crafts that served the castle and its people. Ordinarily, craft apprentices were selected by dint of their parents. Occupations or influences with the craft masters, the castle wards usually had no such influence, and this was their chance to win a future for themselves. Those wards who weren't chosen, or for whom no openings could be found, would be assigned to farming families in the nearby village, providing farm labor to raise the crops and animals that fed the castle's inhabitants. It was rare for this to happen, Will knew. The Baron and his craft masters usually went out of their way to fit the wards into one craft or another. But it could happen, and it was a fate he feared more than anything. Horace caught his eye now and gave him a smug smile. "Still planning on applying for battle school, Will?" he asked, through a mouthful of turkey and potatoes. "Better eat something then. You'll need to build yourself up a little." He snorted with laughter, and Will glowered at him. A few weeks previously, Horace had overheard Will confiding to Alice that he desperately wanted to be selected for battle school, and he had made Will's life a misery ever since, pointing out on every possible occasion that Will's slight build was totally unsuited for the rigors of battle school training. The fact that Horace was probably right only made matters worse. Where Horace was tall and muscular, Will was small and wiry. He was agile and fast and surprisingly strong, but he simply didn't have the size that he knew was required of battle school apprentices. He'd hoped against hope that the past few years that he would have had what people called his growing spurt before the choosing day came around, but it had never happened, and now the day was nearly here. As Will said nothing, Horace sensed that he had scored a verbal hit. This was a rarity in their turbulent relationship. Over the past few years, he and Will had clashed repeatedly. Being the stronger of the two, Horace usually got the better of Will, although very occasionally Will's speed and agility allowed him to get in a surprise kick or a punch and then escape before Horace could catch him. But while Horace generally had the best of their physical clashes, it was unusual for him to win any of their verbal encounters. Will's wit was as agile as the rest of him, and he almost always managed to have the last word. In fact, it was this tendency that often led to trouble between them. Will was yet to learn that having the last word was not always a good idea. Horace decided now to press his advantage. "You need muscles to get into battle school, Will. Real muscles," he said, glancing at the others around the table to see if anyone disagreed. The other wards, uncomfortable at the growing tension between the two boys, concentrated on their plates. "Particularly between the ears," Will replied, and unfortunately Jenny couldn't refrain from giggling. Horace's face flushed, and he started to raise from his seat, but Will was quicker, and he was already at the door before Horace could disentangle himself from his chair. He contented himself with hurling a final insult after his retreating wardmate. "That's right, run away, Will No-Name. You're a no-name, and nobody will want you as an apprentice." In the anteroom outside, Will heard the parting sally and felt blood flush to his cheeks. It was the taunt he hated most. Although he had tried never to let Horace know that, sensing that he would provide the bigger boy with a weapon if he did. The truth was, nobody knew Will's second name. Nobody knew who his parents had been, unlike his yearmates who had lived in the fief before their parents had died and whose family histories were known. Will had appeared virtually out of nowhere as a newborn baby. He had been found wrapped in a small blanket and placed in a basket on the steps of the Ward building 15 years ago. A note had been attached to the blanket reading simply, "His mother died in childbirth. His father died a hero. Please care for him. His name is Will." That year, there had been only one other Ward. Alice's father was a cavalry lieutenant who had died in the Battle of Hackman Heath. When Morgoth's Wargle army had been defeated and driven back to the mountains, Alice's mother, devastated by her loss, succumbed to a fever some weeks after giving birth. So there was plenty of room in the ward for the unknown child, and Baron Arnold was at heart a kindly man. Even though the circumstances were unusual, he had given permission for Will to be accepted as a ward of Castle Redmont. It seemed logical to assume that, if the note were true, Will's father had died in the war against Morgoth, and since Baron Arnold had taken a leading part in that war, he felt duty-bound to honor the unknown father's sacrifice. So Will had become a Redmont ward, raised and educated by the Baron's generosity. As time passed, the others had gradually joined him, and Alice, until there were 5 in their year group. But while the others had memories of their parents, or, in Alice's case, people who had known them and who could tell her about them, Will knew nothing of his past. That was why he had invented the story that had sustained him throughout his childhood in the ward. And, as the years passed and he added detail and color to the story, he eventually came to believe it himself. His father, he knew, had died a hero's death, so it made sense to create a picture of him as a hero, a knight warrior in full armor, fighting against the Wargle hordes, cutting them down left and right, until eventually he was overcome by sheer weight of numbers. Will had pictured the tall figure so often in his mind, seeing every detail of his armor and his equipment, but never being able to visualize his face. As a warrior, his father would expect him to follow in his footsteps. That was why selection for battle school was so important to Will, and that was why the more unlikely it became that he would be selected. And more desperately he clung to the hope that he might. He exited from the ward building into the darkened castle yard. The sun was long down, and the torches placed every 20 meters or so on the castle walls shed a flickering, uneven light. He hesitated a moment. He would not return to the ward and face Horace's continued taunts. To do so would only lead to another fight between them. A fight that Will knew that he would probably lose. George would probably try to analyze the situation for him, looking at both sides of the question and thoroughly confusing the issue. Alice and Jenny might try to comfort him, he knew, Alice particularly, since they had grown up together. But at the moment he didn't want their sympathy and he couldn't face Horace's taunts. So he headed for the one place where he knew he could find solitude. The huge fig tree growing close by the castle's central tower had often afforded him a haven. Heights held no fear for Will, and he climbed smoothly into the tree, continuing long after another might have stopped, until he was in the lighter branches at the very top. Branches that swayed and dipped under the weight. In the past, he had often escaped from Horace up here, The bigger boy couldn't match Will's speed in the tree, and he was unwilling to follow as high as this. Will found a convenient fork and wedged himself into it, his body giving slightly to the movement of the tree as the branches swayed in the evening breeze. Below, the foreshortened figures of the watch made their rounds of the castle yard. He heard the door of the ward building open, and glancing down, saw Alice emerge, looking around the yard for him in vain. The tall girl hesitated a few moments, then, seeming to shrug, turned back inside. The elongated rectangle of the light that opened the door through across the yard was cut off as she closed the door softly behind her. Strange, he thought, how seldom people tend to look up. There was a rustle of soft feathers, and a barn owl landed on the next branch, his head swiveling, its huge eyes catching every last ray of the faint light. It studied him without concern, seeming to know it had nothing to fear from him. It was a hunter, a silent flyer, a ruler of the night. "At least you know who you are," he said softly to the bird. It swiveled its head again, then launched itself off into the darkness, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Gradually, as he sat there, the lights in the castle windows went out one by one. The torches burned down, and the smoldering husks and were replaced at midnight by the change of watch. Eventually, there was only one light left burning, and that, he knew, was in Baron's study, where the Lord of Redmont was still presumably at work, poring over reports and papers. The study was virtually level with Will's position in the tree, and he could see the burly figure of the Baron seated at his desk. Finally, Baron Arnold rose, stretched, and leaned forward to extinguish the lamp as he left the room, heading for his sleeping quarters on the floor above. Now the castle was asleep, except for the guards on the walls, who kept constant watch. In less than 9 hours, Will realized he would face the choosing. Silently, miserably, fearing the worst, he climbed down from the tree and made his way to his bed in the darkened boys' dormitory in the ward. And that's the end of chapter 1. I know I made a few mistakes in there, guys. I'm sorry about that. I'm still getting used to reading out loud. I'm used to reading to myself. So, like I said before, I've never done anything like this, so if you guys could, stick with me and just bear with me a little bit. I'll get better and better. But hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, then hit that like button for me. If you guys have any comments or anything you want to say, go ahead and put them in the comments below. And let me know what you guys think. And if you guys want me to keep doing this or not. I'll probably do it anyway. If you guys don't want to watch it, that's fine. It's whatever. But I enjoy doing it, so I'll probably finish the entire series. Just because. So, hopefully, though, I will see you guys next time. And enjoy your night. And I'll see you guys then.